Today's video is brought to you by Babbel, the #1 language learning app in the world with more than 10 million users worldwide. If there's something I've learned from starting this YouTube channel, it's that language is something you never fully stop learning. As you all know, I'm constantly learning and unlearning how to pronounce words in English, despite having spoken it my entire life. What we're going to be discussing today is one such instance that is the epitome.
Epitome.
And while learning a second language might seem like a daunting task, just know it really doesn't have to be difficult or daunting if you're learning the right way. And the difference with Babbel compared to other language learning programs is that the app actually prepares you for everyday interaction by getting you speaking from the very beginning. And as someone who took multiple years of Spanish in school but learned far more cuando yo trabajé en un restaurante donde todos los cocineros allí solo hablaron español, I can attest to the fact that I learned more when I was exposed to Spanish in a natural way from day-to-day conversation rather than how it was taught to me in a classroom with quizzes and tests. And Babbel's quick lessons give you access to that natural speaking environment right on your phone. Given the fact that just 15 hours in the app has been shown by several efficacy studies to be equal to a full college semester, there's going to be no need for you here to get a student loan to learn a language. Instead, I'd rather give you a link in the description of this video where you can get up to 50% off your Babbel subscription, courtesy of Babbel for viewers of this channel. And thanks again to Babbel for sponsoring this video. If you stare into the blue, you can tell that the world's oceans contain a seemingly endless amount of untold stories and unsolved enigmas. And it's been an area that I've meant to touch on for some time. No pun intended, but if you take a dive down the rabbit hole of maritime mysteries, I wouldn't blame you if you developed a fear of the unknown depths of the Earth's waters. Almost every maritime mystery is unique, sometimes with the weather to blame, or improper ship care, freak accidents, piracy, and of course plain old human error. Even situations and mysteries involving commercial cruising, which is often thought to be a well-documented way of traveling, creates an added layer of complexity in regards to international laws should something happen to you, and you'd honestly be surprised at just how many things go uncharted. But I digress, because in regards to today's video, you may have heard the story of the Mary Celeste, a merchant ship found completely undisturbed and well-provisioned that was adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, with its crew entirely missing in 1872. The question of what happened to the ship's inhabitants has never been conclusively answered, and perhaps even more bizarre, by all accounts, the condition of the Mary Celeste made it appear that the crew had just decided to step off the boat, leaving personal belongings behind with absolutely no sign of struggle or any signs of distress at all. Ever since this incident occurred, the story has been passed down through the generations as one of the most enigmatic incidents to occur at sea with no reasonable explanation. As a result, the Mary Celeste has been nicknamed the Ghost Ship due to the fact that it just simply appeared that the crew had vanished out of thin air. And while you might think that something similar couldn't possibly happen in the modern day, given the technology that we have currently, such as GPS tracking, bank records, video recordings, and detailed weather reports, however, such a thought would be surprisingly incorrect. And that leads me into today's topic, which is a far more modern example of the Mary Celeste. Because today we're going to recount the steps of the ghost yacht, also known as the Kaz II. The year was 2007. 3 Australian men gathered to sail a 9.8-meter fiberglass catamaran named Kaz II out of Airlie Beach in northeastern Australia. They had planned to take a trip to Townsville, Queensland, going around the north side of the continent all the way to the west side. Derek Batten, known by his family and friends as Des, had been planning to make the trip with his wife, Jennifer, for quite some time. But after the couple had gone on an extended cruise during Christmas time, they had reconsidered, because they were concerned should something happen to Des during the trip, that would be a problem which would leave Jennifer to sail the boat on her own. As a result, Des had decided to ask his neighbor Peter Tunstead to come with him instead, and Peter's brother James was suggested as the third crew member given his pre-existing interest in sailing, as he had years of experience racing smaller sailboats. In preparation for the trip, the men took a variety of seafaring courses, including navigation, first aid, and radar to brush up. They also spent a large amount of time plotting courses and charts, inputting them onto 2 laptops they had planned to bring on the journey, and they had their plots checked by more experienced sailors. And while the 3 men did in fact have some sailing experience, this trip was a bit different, as not only was the voyage longer, but it was also taking place on a vessel that was newly purchased and was being brought home. But that being said, it's worth noting that Derek and his wife Jennifer had taken 2 previous trips together on the Kaz II, one of which was a 2-week trip and the other was another 6 weeks. So that's not to say that Derek hadn't done any longer voyages that were comparable. And according to the testimony given by Jennifer, Derek was not only proficient in navigating the boat as it was easy to handle, but Derek was also insistent on taking proper safety precautions in his daily routine, noting that he was generally someone who remained calm and collected. But little did they know that their voyage at the time would puzzle the rest of us for years to come. Now, based on the official inquest, I can give you a full timeline of their trip to bring the Kaz II home. I'm going to go over this timeline in as much detail as possible because the more you mull over the testimonials in the full timeline, which are often left out in the full telling of the story, the more you'll start to realize how important they are to understanding the full context of the mystery. But starting on April 11th, 2007, the men flew into Hamilton Island and took a ferry to Chute Harbor on the mainland. At this point, a local marina worker had given them a ride out to the yacht. On the ride, the men made several comments about their limited sailing abilities, but I will note these comments were seemingly made in a joking manner. On April 12th to the 13th, the men spent these 2 days stocking up the boat with provisions. I will note there's not much other detail about what happened on April 12th and 13th, and officials don't fully know how much was actually loaded onto the boat at this time. However, it's noted that the yacht was moored far out in the harbor, making it a bit more difficult for them to get goods, water, and fuel there. But that's really all that's specified about April 12th and 13th. On April 14th at 10 in the morning, the boat left Chute Harbor. Unfortunately for the men, however, they soon encountered issues with their navigational charts and course. And something seems to have come up on this particular day, despite them planning well ahead of time, that caused them to turn back around, leading them to call the previous owner of the boat, Graham Douglas, to which Graham later agreed to meet them at the marina at Airlie Beach. During this day, he was able to assist them in getting the computers working correctly and input the course for the first stretch of the journey into the GPS manually. On April 15, 2007, between 7 and 8 a.m., the Kaz II was seen leaving the marina. Witnesses claimed to see the men and they seemed to be in good spirits, and it was noted that their engine was quite noisy. But the previous owner of the boat claimed that this was relatively normal for the yacht. At 9:30 a.m., Peter received a call from his wife via Jim's cell phone. During the call, he told her everything was going well with the boat. Derek and Peter were heard teasing James about injuring his foot, although it was never specified how he had done that. They also reported that they were in the process of brewing some coffee, and after this phone call at 9:30 a.m., this was the last time anybody heard from the men again. But obviously, there is more to the story here, because as the ship would go missing, it would lead to various eyewitness testimony to help track it back down. And continuing on with April 15th in our timeline, a woman by the name of Isabel Wheeler, who was fishing close by to where the Kaz II was supposed to be, claimed to have seen a large white vessel which may have been the Kaz II, to which she said it sailed due west towards Gloucester Passage and then changed course by 90 degrees between East Shelby Island and Rattray Island, heading directly out to sea. Now, something I want to make clear about this particular eyewitness testimony was the fact that she had basically just seen a white catamaran on that day. She was unable to say for certain whether this was the Kaz II. But continuing on with the events of April 15th, around midday, Graham Douglas had headed towards Eco Resort, where he had suggested the 3 men should stop on their first day to see if he could meet up with them and find out whether the navigational charts he had helped map had worked properly. On the way there, he also stopped at Dingo Beach, where he expected to be able to catch a glimpse of the yacht, as it should have been passing through the area at the time when he arrived. However, Graham did not see his old boat, and thus continued on to Eco Resort, where he was unable to find the men as well. Hereafter, he made an attempt to call James's phone number and received no answer. At this point, he assumed they must have continued sailing towards the second anchorage point he had suggested. And of the final notable events to have occurred on April 15th was when a member of the Bowen Volunteer Marine Rescue by the name of Ivan Orms claimed that he had radio contact with the boat around 6:45 p.m. He claimed to have spoke with the captain of the boat, which included 3 men on board, and he claimed that they stated that their current location was George Point. Now, this is very bizarre because if this was true, this would have meant that it took 11 or so hours to reach a destination that should have taken only 2.5 hours or so. However, authorities questioned his story as he was apparently home at this time rather than manning the radios at the VMR. Orms later testified that he may have taken the call sometime in the morning when he was there but forgotten to log it until a week later, when he later heard that the Kaz II was missing. Officials believe the reasoning that he listed the time as later in the day was to cover up the fact that he had forgotten to log the call when he was at the base. Now, lapse in memory aside, this does tell us that the boat did reach George Point at some time. Now, on April 16th, a resident of Dingo Beach, Matthew Howie, claimed to have seen the Kaz II in a similar position to where Mrs. Wheeler had described seeing it the day prior. He claimed to have watched the boat for a few minutes and did not observe it making the movements that Mrs. Wheeler had described. Instead, it continued sailing from George Point toward Gloucester Island. Matthew Howie's description of the vehicle did in fact contain distinguishing features of the Kaz II, seeming to make his witness testimony a bit more solid than Wheeler's. And this particular sighting by Matthew Howie was corroborated by his neighbor, who also happened to be looking out that day. Both of the men were insistent that it occurred on April 16th. However, the only difference between the testimony of Howie and his neighbor, Mr. Ian Stonehouse, was the fact that he claimed the boat was going out to sea as well, albeit in a different direction than Mrs. Wheeler had described. Now, out of all the eyewitness accounts from these 2 days, I think it's quite interesting that the person who was actively looking for the boat and was very familiar with its appearance, that being Graham Douglas, who was the previous owner, wasn't able to spot the boat on April 15th, despite being around this location at the exact same time as Mrs. Wheeler. And the fact that the radio operator wasn't even sure what time he received the call doesn't help narrow things down either, especially when you factor in that this guy waited weeks to tell authorities about this particular call, and then later doubled back, claiming that he really wasn't sure about what date it was in the first place. And on a small side note regarding the findings of the state coroner, their wording through and throughout has an air of arrogance to it. And ultimately the goal here should be to have an unbiased investigation, but if you read this particular sentence, it states, his repeated assertions that he was not highly educated and had a terrible memory were, quote, easy to accept. And despite the subtle dig at someone else's intelligence, when the state coroner goes on to spell butt with 2 T's, and the official report contains various grammatical errors and doesn't even appear to have been proofread. And while I'm not one to nitpick on grammar, especially because I make these kinds of mistakes all the time, but the reason I bring this up is due to what happened on April 17th. A day later, on April 17th, 2 coral trout fishing boats in Darley Reef, about 55 nautical miles off of Bowen, had reported seeing the Kaz II drifting across reefs and along channels between them. The fishermen who claimed to have seen the vessel reported seeing no one on the yacht, and from their view, the head sail was torn. None of them had attempted to board the ship or contact it by radio, as they seemed to be convinced that the boat was being manned, as it seemed to navigate intelligently through the reefs there. But according to the investigation, this was impossible, as GPS data that they later recovered from the Kaz II showed no intentional avoidance. But what is rather odd is that later on in the document, they state that they only had data from the 18th and 19th, as when the GPS device that was on the Kaz II was found, it was configured to save memory and delete everything past 2 days. And the device was recovered during the day on the 20th, so how is this information used to debunk something that occurred on the 17th? On April 18th at 3:45 p.m., the Coast Watch surveillance aircraft operated by the Australian Customs Service had also spotted the yacht heading east some 80 nautical miles off the coast of Townsville. Reportedly, as well as the tear in the headsail, there was damage to the mainsail. No attempt to contact the yacht by radio was made, as the aircraft's air-to-ship radio was not functioning properly at the time. Based on their observations, no search and rescue mission was launched at the time. At this time, the Townsville Coast Guard was advised that no distress calls had been made from the Kaz II, and they attempted to contact the vessel by radio, but no response was received. On April 19th, the Coast Watch would locate the Kaz II again. This time, the vessel was facing east and appeared to be dead in the water. Authorities' concerns grew at this observation, and the helicopter was dispatched to board the vessel and assess the situation. Soon after, a video camera was found on board the ship that recorded some of the events of April 15th, around 10 a.m. In this footage, you can see that Dust Batten is at the helm, a blue coffee mug is beside him, Peter Tunstead can be seen fishing off the aft stairway, and James Tunstead appears to be the one that's filming. Getting back to the search and rescue and what they found, the fishing pole that Peter was seen using in that video was found tethered to a stanchion next to the portside sugar scoop. Inside the cabin, everything was notably undisturbed. Assuming they were facing harsh weather, you would expect that there would be things tossed about, but that just wasn't the case. The engine had been idling when they'd found it, and notably, almost everything was in its place, aside from Peter's glasses and shirt, which were taken off at the back. By all accounts of the search crew, it was essentially another Mary Celeste situation, and the only thing missing was the crew. Now, when it comes to theories as to what happened to the men, I think it's proper that we start with the official story from the inquest and move our way from there. And it's worth noting that the coroner in charge of this investigation did state that he was definitely not 100% sure as to the final outcome. And as far as this case went, it was basically an open and shut door, in so much that even the families were very critical of the officials involved with the investigation. While the search lasted quite a bit and involved a large amount of resources, it seems that the ultimate theory that was settled upon was that all three men simply fell overboard. The main piece of evidence that was cited was that some of the fishing line and a lure had been caught in the back rudder. Seeing as Peter could be seen fishing off the back, it's believed that shortly after 10:05 a.m. on April 15th, when that video was timestamped, that an accident had occurred. The investigation believes that Peter fell trying to free the line at full speed, and his brother with an injured foot jumped in after him, to which Des then turned on the engine to save the men overboard and turned quickly around, to which it's believed he went to drop the sails at the top of the deck, and due to the sudden turning, it's believed that he got hit by the crossbar boom as he went to do that. Now, forgive me if I explain any of this wrong, as I'm not someone who has taken up sailing in the past, but as I've spent time reading some of the opinions on other sailors on this case, one of the main criticisms I've seen from other sailors who discuss this topic is the fact that many people cite no need to drop the sails in the first place, but rather just turn the boat around, as it would have wasted plenty of precious seconds to get that man a life ring. After all, this is a sailboat, and no matter what, you're going to have some momentum. The fact that the life ring wasn't used makes this theory questionable, as it would have been completely out of harm's way. Moreover, the boom on the Kaz was well above the covered cockpit, and there seems to be absolutely no reason to climb up to the deck when you can control the boat's sails from the cockpit, as that's where the winches were located. As far as how the sail got ripped, just leaving that out to rub against some of the rigging may cause the sail to rip, especially if it's windy out. But continuing on with another theory that makes a bit more sense to me was that the men were perhaps beached on a sandbar somewhere around George Point, and in their attempts to push the boat free, they could have accidentally dislodged the boat too quickly and have been stranded. Having the boat out in neutral seems to be consistent with this theory, but it's hard to say anything like this happened for certain. Other theories that I've seen passed around involve potential third parties, as the boat's fenders were deployed, which is usually the case if you are docked or next to another vessel, to avoid scratching the hull. But the fact that nothing was stolen and even the laptops were left turned on when they found the boat kind of rules out malice in the form of piracy. Also, these fenders can get left out just by way of forgetfulness, so this detail may be nothing. Lastly, had some freak wave or bad weather struck the men unexpectedly, you would expect the cabin to have been worse for wear, but the tidy nature of it all seems to rule out any unexpected turbulence or a rogue wave. I will say one thing that caught my attention throughout this entire mystery was the uncertainty of the early timeline and boat position. As you can probably tell from this video, eyewitness testimony is anything but reliable, but one thing that bugs me is the fact that 2 out of the 3 eyewitness accounts seem to claim to have seen a boat on the 16th rather than the 15th. And had some of the passerbys checked on the boat earlier, less data would have been deleted from the GPS, and we would have been able to specify a disaster point or provide clarity of what actually happened. Another thing that rubbed me the wrong way about this case too was the fact that in some of the initial news reports, the man who first boarded the boat claimed to see a bunch of knives strewn along the floor. To which I will note, I was unable to find the full video footage of the man going on board, and in his initial statement, the rescue officer stated, "I didn't know if someone was going to burst through a cupboard and go at me with a knife. I saw all the knives on the ground, but no blood, and I thought, what the?" And according to the official inquest, there were no knives on the floor, and the rescue worker had simply been making flippant comments that were misconstrued by the media. Like I said previously, the whole tone of this inquest seems dismissive, and in my personal opinion, perhaps the most annoying detail about this whole thing was the fact that authorities refused to take any fingerprints below deck despite the family requesting it. Their justification for not taking any fingerprints was that the place was too clean, and had it been pulled apart, then they would have taken fingerprints. If I had to interject my own personal opinion as to why they probably didn't take any, I would reason more that the forensic investigation had already touched everything inside the boat by the time this was asked. To which the coroner wrote, "Family members have raised concerns about the decision not to search for fingerprints or other scientific evidence on the Kaz II. I find that concern wholly understandable in the context of the men disappearing without a trace. However, I am equally satisfied that there was nothing to warrant such further steps." There's definitely something to be said about an investigation that both admits they can't be certain of the events that occurred, but refuse to look for more info. Ultimately, I'd love to know what your guys' theories are about what happened, because it seems like this is just another case that has had all leads submerged into the deep blue. This is Barely Sociable. Have a good night.
Yeah.